I think, therefore I am. But I'm thinking all the time, and I don't know who I am. Am I? Are you? I'm in the middle of nowhere, and it's a good place to be. Welcome to Just Nowhere with Dr. Samuel Zinner. Today, I'm really grateful to have you here, Joel Rubin. Can you tell us where you are today? Just so
That
people
would be outing
know.
myself. I'm in a little Swiss village
Excellent.
that's near Zurich and Lucerne, and
Yes, wonderful.
it's called Bunsen, but nobody knows what it is except for comedy fans because it's the village is so insignificant that there was a Swiss comedian who did a whole routine about a guy who's, I think he's on vacation and he's visiting his friends in our little village, and he's
Mhm.
talking to the phone company. He wants them to transfer his phone bill or his phone calls or something, and it gets more and more confused. uh,
Well,
he gets more and more desperate as he's trying to explain the situation to some bureaucrat. that's
uh,
that's the only thing that anybody knows about our village.
sure. Well, I'm
Just
in an
cows.
even
There
more
are cows and sheep.
obscure Italian village,
Yeah.
Aula, and no one knows anything about it, except if you look into the distance, about 30 minutes drive away are these mountains that are white, right? And this is where Michelangelo would get his marble. So maybe he took a horse through here once. I don't know, but
Okay.
no one knows about Aula. But anyway, where are you currently teaching?
I'm actually not teaching at the moment. I mean, I teach occasionally at
Sure.
workshops, like I've taught many times at Yiddish Summer Weimar. Not
Hmm.
this year, but last year I was there. Um, I was teaching until 2 years ago for 15 years at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville,
All right.
and I was commuting back and forth for 12
Hmm.
of those between our little farming village and
Sure.
Charlottesville. And I'm affiliated with the University of Bern.
All
Um,
right. All right.
in
That's
the
what I
department,
noticed
yeah, Department of
online.
Musicology and Jewish Studies. But I have, or it's actually institutes, they call them.
Sure.
But I haven't done any teaching yet. I
All
might.
right. That's fine. And I listened to that very in-depth, right, interview you did, I believe, for the Wexler Oral Project. So
Oh,
I'll put a link to
okay.
that for the viewers, right? So all of that is available already. So I don't like to spend time on information or topics that people could just easily get from somewhere already,
Sure.
right? So just for the sake of this interview, I would like to start off with the short version, as short as you want to. How did you get from California to this little village you're at now? I mean, just the high points.
Very circuitously. I guess the short version is I grew up in LA. Um, Decided when I was about 15 or so, 15 or 16, that I wanted to become a professional musician.
Mhm.
I went to California Institute of the Arts, which was about 20 miles away, and never looked back. So I studied there for a couple of years, and then I transferred to SUNY, well, at what was at that time called SUNY Purchase.
Mhm.
I think it's called Purchase College. It was Rockefeller's dream. It was sort of the East Coast version of Cal Arts. Um,
Mhm.
it was an arts conservatory within a liberal arts setting. So they had two halves of the university. Was one part was liberal arts and one part was performing and visual arts and that sort of thing.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, and I ended up there because my teacher, Richard Stoltzman, was at CalArts, but he was becoming increasingly well known and was touring increasingly. And he basically said he didn't think he was doing me any favor by
Mhm.
continuing to try to teach me under those circumstances. So he sent me to his teacher. That's how I ended up in New York. And I stayed there for 4 years after I graduated. I stayed for another year or so, and I was gigging around playing classical music and so forth. And then I decided that wasn't really what I wanted to be doing, and I moved back to the West Coast. So I lived in Portland for a number of years, and then San Francisco, and it was during that period that I got interested in, and also a year in Boston, and I got interested in other kinds of music. I mean, I'd
Mhm.
always been interested in other kinds of music, but I became interested in performing other kinds of music.
Right.
And among other things, I became exposed to klezmer music, Jewish instrumental klezmer music, during the year I was living in Boston. That was in 79, 80.
Mhm.
And immediately upon returning to Portland that spring, started a klezmer band there. It was the first klezmer band in Portland and one of the few in the country at that time.
Right.
And just got really deeply into that for many, many years. Um, Along the way, that took me to Berlin, where I lived for a number of years. And while I was in Berlin, I decided I wanted to go back and do a PhD in ethnomusicology
Mhm.
and to write a dissertation on klezmer, which hadn't really been done before. I mean, there's a guy
Mhm.
named Moshe Beregovsky who has gotten a lot of attention recently because
Mhm.
of a documentary film about him and because of the uh, Kisselhoff Makanovetsky digital music archive
Mhm.
project
Mhm.
that comes from the archive that he was administering. Um, he wrote a sort of a dissertation in the Soviet period,
Mhm.
but it was very short. I mean, I think the text that was submitted is maybe 50 pages or something. So
Right.
it's not
Right.
a dissertation by our contemporary standards, but he did get a
Yes.
doctoral
Right.
title from that work. So I wouldn't say it
Mhm.
was the first, but it was certainly the first in English and the first
Mhm.
kind of extensive study, which was based
Yes.
in New York.
Mhm.
Klezmer musicians, and then I spent like several decades messing around with it until it finally came out as a book.
Mhm.
Uh,
Mhm.
New York Klezmer in the early 20th century, um, just 3 years ago.
Sure.
So when I was about to retire from UVA.
Yes. Well, I have read your dissertation,
Oh,
and
so you're one of the only people who's read my dissertation
it's
and
rather lengthy, but it doesn't take too long to read through it because a lot of it is rather musical score examples and samples. So,
yeah,
um, but before before launch into questions about klezmer music, which I would want to start off with, I want to go back. I don't know how much or how deeply you might be interested in this topic, but I'll throw it at you. And that is, right? Have you ever thought about the origins of music among our species, right?
oh
Because
wow,
there are different
there
theories, of course, as you know. But is
there
that
are. Yeah.
something you've ever thought about?
Oh, I've thought about it, but there are lots of other people who've thought about it a lot more than I have.
All right, all
Let's
right,
just put it that way. But yeah, I mean, that's sort of like early cultural musical anthropology or something like that.
sure, sure, sure.
That's a little bit out of my
Well, that's fine.
sphere.
The reason I went there is to because of the little exchange we had in email about
Yeah.
Chomsky and the
Hmm.
comparison with the music. So before we go there, let
Okay.
me just fill you in, at least on my opinion, which I didn't
Okay.
develop. I'm pretty persuaded by I think it was a 2007 article by Nobuo Masataka, right?
Hmm.
And yeah, I'll go ahead and put a link to that article as well when I upload this, just for everyone's reference. But
Hmm.
he harkened back to Darwin's theory,
Hmm.
and but he first Darwin's theory was that um, there was a he thought there might have been a communication system, right, that resembled music more closely than language, right,
Hmm.
but identical to neither. And so I think Masataka calls it like a prosodic proto language, right? So it's the
Yeah.
precursor of both language and music. And the segue to what we
Yeah.
briefly exchanged about is his point that, all right, so language and music, when we look at them, what do they have in common? at least according to Masataka, and he's right. All right, both are human universals, and both have phrase structure,
Hmm.
and both entail learning and cultural transmission. And I was a little surprised that he didn't hit on what you and I discussed, right, at your prompting,
Hmm.
right, which is, the you brought it up in the context of improvisation. So there's this
Hmm.
potential infinity, right, of variation. All right, so you want to tell us about how you might yourself compare music and language?
Sure. Well, just to come back to your first question, I mean, I think certainly within the Jewish context,
Mm-hmm.
um, it's clear. I mean, it seems fairly clear that chanting the Torah
Mm-hmm.
it's not, it's performative, but it's not really music, but it's musical. It's got melody. I
Mm-hmm.
don't know. It doesn't. I think the phrases are. I don't remember who it was. Kurt Sachs, I think, said it was logogenic or logocentric or something like that. That, in other words, the
Mm-hmm.
text
Mm-hmm.
determines everything, and that
Right, right.
melody is incidental to that, just to clarify the
Yes,
punctuation and so
yes.
forth. But it's so central to Jewish life, at least in recent millennia, that it kind of, everything else sort of came out of that, I think,
Right,
originally
right, right.
within Jewish society. But I mean, of course, Jews were never living in a vacuum,
Right.
and
I was
there
absorbing from the
was
surrounding
music long
society.
before there were Jews. So, um, that observation probably doesn't really go nearly deep enough to what you're asking.
Mm.
Um, Yeah, as far as music and language goes, I mean, it's true, right? Music has a kind of a syntax and a kind of a grammar, and um, maybe under, like, what I was interested in were sort of underlying deep structures, in a very sort of
Mhm.
loose analogy to what Noam Chomsky was talking about, in terms of um, like, he talks about, like, these simple sentence transformations. What the boy
Right.
was riding the bicycle was ridden by the boy.
Mhm.
We know it means the same thing, and yet it's two completely different sentences. There's some
Mhm.
some underlying concept that guides that. And so what I was finding, actually, was I started looking at, and this is something I talked a lot about with my friend Josh Horowitz, who you might know. He's another friend of Martin Schwartz. He's a musicologist and performer that I've worked with a lot, at cadential endings in klezmer tunes. And I
Mhm.
think this is true for most Eastern European music, is that they're highly formulaic. And so I started looking
Mhm.
at you probably recognize this. I don't know if I can get this so that the camera can really see it very well,
A
but
little bit. There you go.
yeah,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
you can see
Yes.
on the
Mhm.
left side are kind of the kernel sentences, as well as it were, the kernel motifs.
Mhm.
And then you can see, like, of this one particular type of cadential ending, there are three
Mhm.
basic variants, and of those, each one of those variants can then be varied in various ways, and it's determined partly by what tone the previous phrase ends on, and what
Sure.
tone
Of
the
course.
next
Mhm.
phrase begins on, and all that sort of thing. But
Mhm.
I think where it breaks down, of course, is that it has no meaning, right? In the sense
Right.
that
Right.
language has meaning, words have meaning that we know, like you say tree, and we all know more or less what a tree looks like, and so forth. Um, so there's been some ethnomusicologists and anthropologists who've looked pretty closely at this. And one article that I read, that really looked at a lot of the literature, was by Stephen Feld and Aaron Fox. I think they were both at Columbia at the time, and
Mhm.
they basically sort of came to the same conclusion, that there are similarities, and you can carry it to a certain extent, but then it ultimately breaks down.
Right. Right.
Um,
Yeah. Well, as I responded in the email to
mm,
you, and I think this will be of interest to the audience, at least to
mhm,
those interested in such subjects, is that we might be able to carry it a little further, in my
mhm,
opinion, because a lot of linguists, especially in earlier times, but unfortunately even now, right,
mhm,
we're not too convinced of the presence of what we call phonosemantics in
mhm,
human language. Everyone recognizes right. There are some words that are phonosemantic, like onomatopoeia and things
mhm.
like this. But in general, most linguists still, I think, almost mindlessly repeat Ferdinand de Saussure's
Mhm.
the radical arbitrariness of language theory,
Mhm.
without knowing, unfortunately, that towards the end of his life, he repudiated that model.
Yeah.
He said it's impossible because if it were so, you could never get from syntax to semantics, right, to actual conversation. So there has to
Mhm.
be some connection between how the words are sounding and that to which they are referring. And he never published, right, this fact that he had retracted it, right, but it's in all of his private correspondence. And I came to know of this through a very interesting, very slim philosophical volume by our philosopher here in Italy, Giorgio Agamben, right,
Mhm.
who brought this out. And so he pointed out that Saussure never made this repudiation public because he couldn't figure out what to replace it with, right? I think, I'll make this as briefly as I
Mhm.
can. I think that the beginnings of a replacement are actually a different theory that he had.
Mhm.
He probably didn't see a connection, but he never published this other theory. And this is one that we'll talk about Martin Schwartz later, but
Mhm.
one that Martin Schwartz is very interested in, and that is
Mhm.
Saussure's anagram theory. And
Mhm.
a really brief example of that is, for instance, in Homer's Iliad, when a scene with Agamemnon begins, right? Agamemnon, uh, leading up to the mention of the name Agamemnon, and then after it, you'll see a proliferation in different sequences of the letters and the phonemes of the name Agamemnon,
Mhm.
right? And so the reason Saussure never published on this, even though he has a massive amount of notes on it, was he couldn't be sure if it was just random, right? And I think that issue was settled by Roman Jakobson or Jacobson, one of
Mhm.
the greatest linguists, Russian linguists of the 20th century. And he said, well, some of these really amazing patterns, really mind boggling patterns sometimes, they don't all have to be consciously made by the performer. Some of this could be coming up from the subliminal
Mhm.
areas of the mind, right? Because the poet is well trained, and stuff
Mhm.
is just going to come up like someone who studied Rachmaninoff's Third Piano Concerto, right? It's in the fingers, right? They don't. Yeah. So anyway, um, in recent years, there have been abundant scientific papers, really convincing ones, that show that thousands of human languages have a high degree of phonosemantics. And so, anyway,
Do you
uh,
mean cross-culturally or within each system?
cross culturally.
Uh-huh.
So we're talking
Yeah.
Semitic languages, Indo
Right.
European, Asiatic, indigenous, right? And, you know, I think I mentioned to you, I may have, may not, but, you know, for linguists, the famous Kiki Booba tests, right?
Mhm.
So this works in Africa, in Europe, in Asia. You ask children or adults, right? All right, here are two images. One has nice rounded edges, the other has jagged edges. Which one is Kiki and which is Booba? And almost everyone will say, oh, yeah, the Booba, that's the one with the nice rounded edges. And Kiki, right, that's the jagged one.
Right.
Right. And so, so it may be that, right. So we have morphemes, which are semantic carrying, a small
Mhm.
number of them, but we have a even smaller number of the phonemes, which do not carry meaning. Right.
Mhm.
However, right, if we stop to think about it, there are certain phonemes that do carry a certain amount of meaning.
Mhm.
Right. And we can think of them. Uh, depending on which language one is speaking, right? O is one of these,
Mhm.
right? Ma, right, for
Mhm.
mama, right?
Mhm.
So you know, it works to a certain extent, right? So
Mhm.
and so I've wondered also if you can have a single musical note, but depending on the way that you execute it, it can carry a little bit more meaning than it does, um, you know,
Right.
abstractly as such by itself, right? So you think of staccato or prolonged, right, augmented
Mhm.
or something like this. So I actually think that we might be able to carry the comparison between music and language a bit
Mhm,
further, and I think the the crucial shared aspect here between language and music is this what Chomsky calls infinite variability. I call it
mhm,
potentially infinite, but we're splitting hairs, maybe, you know. But you can take these individual notes, and
mhm,
there's potentially no end to how you can use them, right? So maybe the correspondence is not exact when we think of right the semantics involved in language, but I
mhm.
think this infinite variability is really important.
Yeah. I mean, infinite is probably an exaggeration because, of course, each musician,
Yeah, yeah,
depending on how sophisticated they are, is still going to be limited by their ability to
yeah,
transform. But yeah,
that's right.
so it's like
Yeah,
the difference between the vocabulary that Shakespeare had and the vocabulary that somebody who reads, I don't know, Reader's Digest or
I
something.
know. Yeah. Well,
Mentioning it.
well, there's a lot of philosophical
Yeah.
issues here, depending
Uh,
on who you prefer. I mean, I'm an Aristotelian on this point.
mhm,
He talked about potential infinity
mhm, yeah.
because actual infinity in a physical cosmos doesn't make much sense to me. But
Yeah.
that's just me, you know.
So the other thing that interested me, or that sort of got me interested in this connection with language, was there. I don't know if he's still alive, but I think he might be Canadian, um, a composer and musicologist, Raymond Monell, who
Oh
wrote
yes.
musical semiotics, and he did a in his book on that. He went through all of that literature that you're talking
Hmm.
about, and looking at ways that different musicologists and ethnomusicologists and
Hmm.
music theorists have tried to apply some of those things.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Well, yeah. One complicating factor is, how does each linguist define the term language? Right. There's
yeah,
some see it as to origins a communication system, whereas Chomsky would sharply disagree, and I would too.
mhm,
Uh, I would say humans. It sounds, sort of arrogant, but I think it's just factual, and that is humans are the only species with language. Other animals like whales, dolphins, bees, they have communication systems or signal codes, right? So they don't have
mhm,
these, basic units or phonemes that they can
right,
vary infinitely, right? Maybe they will eventually, right?
yeah,
Given enough more time. But in any case, the definition of language can complicate it. But I don't see language, right? It's certainly a communication tool, but I don't think that's explains the origins of it.
mhm,
So I don't think of language as communication any more than I do. I think of music as just communication. Oh, there's a lot more going on there than just I want to get a feeling or I want to get an idea across. It's much more complex than that.
mhm. And people respond to it in so many different ways. But I mean, I think one of the things that interested me about klezmer music in particular is it's extremely eclectic, and it
Hmm.
draws at the confluence of several different traditions.
Hmm.
On the one hand, from the sort of the Ottoman legacy of
Hmm.
uh, well, sort of shadows or remnants of Ottoman classical
Hmm.
modality, partly from the Jewish liturgical
Right.
modality, and partly from uh, kind of scales and modes and ways of making music that were common in various Eastern European countries, especially in
Right.
Romania, but also Greece, Ukraine,
Greece.
etc.
Hmm.
And then Western, what we would call, Western classical music,
Sure.
mo- um, harmonic, tonic dominant harmonies and that sort of thing. And it flows between them sort of at will.
Hmm.
And that raises all kinds of questions about emotion, like you said about emotion. So one of the key things about modal music, and it's in the classic sense, is that each mode is supposed to correspond to something. It corresponds to a time of the day, or to the year, or to an
Sure.
emotional state, or
Hmm.
whatever. And and this has been associated sometime at times with certainly with Hindustani music, but also with just with Turkish music and so forth. But in
Hmm.
the case of these eclectic types of music, it sort of breaks down because they'll break into something that seemingly sounds lamenting, into something that sounds very almost silly,
Hmm.
uh, in a blink of an eye, and then
Hmm.
back again, and but without any apparent meaning in that sense. It's not like now
Hmm.
we're getting sad, oh now we're happy again, and this sort of thing. Those meanings are sort of not there. So that's why it's
Hmm.
really sort of remnants of because they're all serving the same. So the lamenting, I think, is overriding in this music, especially in um, the non-dance
Hmm.
music, because so much of the I guess I'm getting ahead of our conversation, but I
No,
mean,
that's fine.
the real reason for being of this music was to accompany the various rituals around the traditional Jewish wedding, and the wedding day is
Hmm.
uh, is a fast day in very traditional society. Is a fast day. Equated to to Yom Kippur and all of these kinds of things.
Right.
So there is this. It's supposed to bring, especially the bride, to think about this important transition from girlhood
Hmm.
to womanhood, which is first marked really by the wedding
Hmm.
in traditional Jewish society. Um, so there is that, I think, for sure. But once you get that into the more kind of just functional, either dance music or background music for while people are eating, or accompanying people through the streets from one event to another, or
Right. Right.
accompanying the parents of the bride back home and stuff, that it sort of breaks down at that point.
Right. Right. Well, I know you offered a definition of klezmer music in your dissertation.
Yes.
Have you developed the definition, or is it basically the same?
Um, I probably have not developed it all that much further. I mean, I think um, wh- what did I say? It was at the confluence that it was a specific repertoire played in a specific style in a specific region, specific
Right.
set of
Right.
instruments, and so forth.
Uh, and
Um,
what you just said, right, covers some of the definition as
and
well.
that its primary function, although of course it spread out from there,
Hmm.
was to accompany the
Right.
Jewish wedding, which of course could last for a number of days and sometimes
Right.
even
Right.
weeks, depending on the
Yes,
collapse of the family.
yes. In traditional cultures, you after the second night, you start entering an altered state of consciousness, almost.
Yeah.
Uh,
So,
yeah,
but I think, all of those definitions are ultimately a little bit useless in the sense that a klezmer is a profession, right? It's a professional musician.
yeah, yes, yes.
And they played not only for Jews, they played for peasants, they played
Mhm.
for aristocrats, especially because they had the money. Um, they could, in many cases, they could not support themselves from playing for Jews alone,
Mhm.
even if they wanted to. Um, and so, the other at the other extreme, the definition would be, well, if there is such a thing as klezmer music, it's anything that a klezmer played. But
Yeah,
of course,
yes.
that if you transport that into the 21st century, it's like if you play celebration or
Pretty
macarena or
wide.
something at the wedding, is that klezmer music just
Right.
because you're a klezmer musician or whatever. So it's sort of somewhere between those two extremes, I think.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm. Well,
and then it's sort of like it's an open system, right? This is
mhm.
one of the things. It's just like I did draw a number of comparisons to the way that Yiddish language developed, because Yiddish speakers in Eastern Europe were also, in many cases, fluent in other languages, especially
Sure.
say
Hmm.
Russian, Polish, um, depending on area,
Ukrainian, Greek. Yeah.
Ukrainian, etc. And so they could easily go from, let's say, they would be speaking in Yiddish, and you find this in Yiddish literature all the time. They'll be speaking in Yiddish, and then there will be a long passage in Russian,
Mhm.
and then
Sure.
it'll go back to Yiddish. or maybe it's just one sentence or even only a part of a sentence, but they're completely comfortable from sort of code switching, as it were, between these different
Right.
languages. And that happens in the music too. So these musicians would be, so that's what I think one thing that accounts for this. You'll have something that sounds very kind of Ottoman or something, and then it'll
Sure.
go to the next section. It sounds all of a sudden like a polka, and then
Hmm.
it'll go to another section that might sound Romanian or something, and it's not a contradiction. It's just they understood all of those things. So if they could switch to this other mode, not musical mode, but mode of musical communication, they and their audience would understand that because they were familiar with all of that.
Right.
Um,
A true fluency.
yeah,
Yes. Yes.
right.
Yes.
As opposed to say in America, which is, well, a big chunk of America is monolingual English.
Hmm.
Um, but even in well, I mean, in modern, Western Europe, of course, there's so many languages and so many
Hmm.
small culture groups and things. It's not. I don't think it's this. You can make the same comparison to say
Yeah, not at all.
the Jews living at the borderlands of Ottoman Russian Empire and the Prussian
Hmm.
Empire, German Empire or whatever,
Sure.
Austro-Hungarian Empire. I mean,
Yeah.
um, where it was part of their daily reality.
Right. Well, so how does Marty or Martin Schwartz enter the picture in
Oh,
your life,
oh well,
vis-a-vis Klezmer, of course?
yeah. Well, of course, I mean, I got interested in klezmer in 1979, 80, and I, was immediately in contact with the other people who were doing it at the time.
Mm,
There weren't that many, and among others, I was in touch with a violinist who was an ethnomusicology student at the time named Sandra Lehman, who lives in Seattle. She's also knows quite a number of languages, and she was friendly with Marty, and
mm,
said, "Oh, you have to go meet Marty." So that not only she said that, other people said that too.
mm,
I mean, everybody knew him at that time. Anybody pretty much who was involved in klezmer music knew Marty at that time because he had one of the larger private collections of old 78s, not just
mm,
of klezmer music, but of Yiddish song and of
mm,
Turkish music and Greek music and Armenian music and
mm,
all kinds of interesting things. And so at my first opportunity, I traveled from Portland to San Francisco, or to
mm.
the San Francisco Bay Area,
Yeah. Yes.
and I met Marty. That was in the summer of probably 1980, maybe
Mm,
81. I don't remember. It's more than 40 years ago in any case.
yeah.
Um, and we hit it off instantly. And when I went over to his house and he was playing me recordings, and of course we had a cassette recorder and
Sure.
making dubs, and this
Yeah.
is how you passed music along in those days before
I
any
remember.
device
Yes.
or anything. And then at about midnight, uh, I played him some stuff on my clarinet, and he liked it.
Mm,
And then at midnight, he calls his mother in New York. So it was like 3 in the morning, and she was probably over 70 at that time, I'm guessing.
mhm,
Uh, and he has me play a doina for her over the telephone. Now, I don't know
mhm,
why he had me play a doina, because she was from an area where doinas weren't that widely known, but I guess she's
mhm,
familiar with it anyway. So she liked it. So that was sort of like,
mhm.
I think he wanted to see if I got her stamp of approval. That was sort of a little bit of a midnight rite of passage. So we've been in touch ever since, in greater or lesser degree. When I was first living I moved to Europe in 1989.
Mhm.
So I'd been living in San Francisco. So I used to talk to him on the phone all the time, and we would visit and so forth. And then if you talked on the phone with Marty, it was inevitable that after you hung up 5 minutes later, he would call back because he thought of something else to talk about.
Right.
Um, and now it's with emails, it's the same. But in that interim
Sure.
period, when I moved in 1989 to Berlin, there was no email yet, or at least I didn't have it.
Right.
And I don't think he did either. He had a computer that he refused to open the box
Yeah.
for a number of years. So
Mhm.
we were out of touch, not completely out of touch, but out of touch for a while. But once things started going again with the internet and with email and so forth,
Sure.
we're not in daily touch, but sometimes we're in touch daily,
Mhm.
multiple times. I guess I should back up and say Marty is he's not a professional musicologist or ethnomusicologist, but he's a linguist and an
Mhm.
ancient Iranist,
Mhm.
and but has incredibly good ears. He doesn't read music, but he hears connections between musical cultures, and so he was the one who started
Mhm.
really drawing the connections between Ottoman Greek and Yiddish music that I think were not really known up until that point.
Mhm.
And he developed that quite a lot. And now there's a few of us who are sort of following in his footsteps, myself and Josh. And there's a wonderful Greek ethnomusicologist named Nikos Ordoulidis,
Mhm.
who's working in this area. And we collaborate largely via email, and sometimes multiple times daily. So that's quite exciting. But that's kind of how, yeah. So Marty's been sort of a constant presence in my life for more than 40 years.
Yeah, he's. I believe currently. I believe his the exact title is what he's the at University of California at Berkeley, the um, professor emeritus of Iranian studies. I I believe, or Iranic.
Iranian studies or ancient Iranian studies, something like that. Yeah, that's
Yes.
his real métier is finding anagrams in Zoroaster
Yeah,
or
that's how I got connected
yeah.
with him via a mutual friend who lives in Georgia, Tbilisi, Georgia.
Hmm.
And so we started off with a lot of conversations about anagrams.
Hmm.
And that's very interesting what you mentioned about him there. I wasn't aware of that. I was just assuming he could read music. But see, he has a good ear and he can make these connections. Now, this, I think, facilitates his ability to identify these acrostics in oral quote unquote literature, oral texts like Zarathustra's Gathas, right?
Hmm.
Which before he came along, I'm not aware of anyone who would claim that acrostics are to be found in oral literature. That was usually assumed to be
Yeah,
something you find in like the
amazingly.
Hebrew Bible, right? Or right, but I think he has a really strong case, and
Yeah.
he's I
And
don't know if
having the background in comparative linguistics, of course, helps with all of these things because it helps
mhm.
comparing across musical cultures, even if we don't have the international phonetic system or whatever it's called.
Well, in an interview I did with him, he cited a portion of the Gathas, and
Mhm.
he pronounced it the passage in a very idiosyncratic way in order to point out the
Mhm.
acrostic.
Mhm. Mhm.
And it to me it makes a lot of sense that um, the oral text could originally have been delivered in such an odd way in order to help the audience out a little bit, right?
Mhm.
To give them a clue, something special is going on here. There's
Mhm.
something buried there, something esoteric. I think, of course, that's Zarathustra's Gathas, but I think that there's a similar um, preoc- preoccupation, right, with the esoteric and hidden structures, right, in Judaism when it comes to the Hebrew Bible or even the liturgy. Um, and
Even the PU team are full of those kinds of things.
yes, they are especially the acrostics.
Mhm.
Um, I'm thinking also of
The title of the author is woven in, or if it's
right.
dedicated to a particular family, certain details about the family are woven in, and so forth.
Right, and there are the liturgical pieces that predate the PU team. So the PU team are the ones where we start to see the acrostics
Mhm.
of the names. But before then, you had these anonymous, and they tended to be the
Mhm.
acrostics of the Hebrew letters,
Mhm.
the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, like the Sabbath, Shabbos, El Adon, right? So 22 lines. Each line begins with the consecutive letters of the Hebrew alphabet.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's El Baruch, which 22 words,
Mm-hmm.
right? Each of which is beginning with one of these, with the consecutive letters. And then, oddly, right, there are, after the 22 words, right, the 22nd word beginning with Tav, there are
Mm-hmm.
4 more words.
Mm-hmm.
So why? Well, I think it's pretty obvious. 26, is the numerical value of the tetragrammaton.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think those kind of structures,
Mm-hmm.
right, are found throughout. And the El Adon, I know there's this very complex commentary on it in the Zohar, right? It points
Mm-hmm.
out a lot of the numerical features of that as well. And I'm very interested in that, but also I think that I like to see that preoccupation with numerical structures and uh, letter structures or phonetic structures, right? That goes all the way back to the Hebrew Bible, I think, especially the Tehillim, the Psalms. And some biblical scholars, right, divided about this, right? Did they know gematria yet, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I think it's pretty clear that they did. But in any case, I don't think there would be much debate about, let's say, the liturgy. El Adon, for example, that the gematria there, El is 31, Adon would be 61, gives you 92. And so after those 2 introductory words, which are printed larger, right, in traditional Sidurim, there are 92 words. And then that's immediately followed by Lol El, which, right, cites from Psalm 92.
Yeah.
Right, so there's some very sophisticated numerical illusions, these hidden illusions, right? And
Mm-hmm.
not everyone gets them. Martin and I just separately read an essay by a man named Klotz on anagrams in Pharaonic texts. Right,
Mm-hmm.
and he joked to me and said, "Yeah, what was it, like 2 or 3 priests at that time, and their buddies knew this, could see this." But anyway, I do think that um, there is this preoccupation, right, with hidden structures that you have to search for and you have to apply yourself and
Yeah.
study to find. But in any case, I want to take advantage of the interview here. One of my favorite albums that you've produced is Midnight Prayer. So I wanted to
Oh, I'm
ask
glad you
you,
said that. That's still my favorite.
all right, so I wanted to ask you, uh, can you sort of give the short history right behind that, and then of course why you chose that particular title? And I
Aha.
love the
Okay.
photo on the front of it, by the way. It's wonderful.
The photo is, of course, it's a little bit of a stretch because it was taken in Swad, and the music is
Uh,
all from Eastern Europe. But it was just such a lovely image of this
sure, sure.
guy with the moon, and it's like a sleeping rabbi or something on the
Hmm.
temple,
Hmm.
uh, the
That's the
synagogue roof with the moon in the background.
yeah.
Um, well, the music, so that's coming back to Birogovsky. At that time, of course, we didn't have access to any of the manuscripts. They were in the
Mm,
Vernadsky Library, National Library of Ukraine. They still are, if the library still exists. So hopefully they'll survive the war along
yes,
with the people who live there. Um,
yes.
but uh, but Birogovsky in his lifetime had published or prepared for publication excerpts from these manuscripts that he and his predecessors had collected, because it goes back to the Yansky expeditions of the pre-World War One, the
Mm.
few years leading up to
From the
the
Tsarist
World
period.
War One. Um, and those first became available to us in the West. Mark Slobin, who was really the first ethnomusicologist to really take Yiddish musical cultures seriously and started publishing about it in the I guess he started working it on in the 70s, but this came out in the early 80s, maybe in 81 or 82 or something, was an anthology of Yiddish folk songs and klezmer music from Biography collection. And so when that first came out, I was already interested in these things. I guess my feeling at that time had been, but these are just notations, right? So much of the music, basically 90+% of the actual music in klezmer music or any of these oral traditions is in the performance practice. And so the notes are just the structure to build that around. And I felt like I need to really get much more fluent in the style based on existent recorded examples, most of which were commercial recordings because there weren't that many field recordings that were available at that time. But I always had that in my mind. And then even when, so I was I was one of the founding members of Brave Old World, which started up in the late 80s. And and I was in that group, I guess, for about 4 years, 3-4 years. And towards the end of my time there, we started experimenting with reading down tunes out of Berezovsky's publication, which by that time his I guess it was sort of a slightly abridged version or radically abridged, depending on whom you ask, a version of his dissertation with the musical notes that had been set in the late 30s, but had never been published. And then it was brought out posthumously in, I think it was the mid to late 80s. So it was around that time. And then we started working through these and seeing what we could do with them, but we never did anything or never did much with them. But then when I started working as a duo with Josh Horowitz as Rubin and Horowitz, we did an album called Bessarabian Symphony. That's this one. And that about half of that album is based on these manuscripts or these notations. So I was already into that. And then I did another one called Beregovsky's Chasane, which was almost entirely based on his manuscripts. And so Midnight Prayer was kind of the fully, I guess, developed vision of what that could be like. And I was using by that point mostly musicians from Eastern Europe. They were 4 Hungarians, 3 of whom are Roma, and then one was a Jewish guy in that, not that iteration. Then I had a Russian Jewish violinist on Midnight Prayer, and a couple of other musicians, a wonderful Italian accordionist who had been playing klezmer music or some version of klezmer music as a youth in Italy, but who's really one of the world's foremost performers of contemporary classical music on the accordion. Just a great musician, Claudio Iacomucci. So he was in the group. And so that was the opportunity to sort of really dig into this material and make something that sort of told a story through these melodies. Not putting them together, not trying to put them together in the sequence they might have been played at a wedding, but putting them together in a sequence and in combinations that made musical sense to really have kind of a shape to it and so forth. And so the Midnight Prayer that's actually the title of one of the tunes, but it's from it's called Chtsois or Tikkun Chatzot in Hebrew, I guess. It's it refers to prayers that are said in the early morning hours at certain times of the year in various communities. It's still done today, I think, in some of the Middle Eastern Jewish communities or communities that had, and some of those that are in Israel. Turkish communities did this, but also some of the Eastern European communities, some of the more ones that were more in the sort of mystical direction.
And Morocco, they do it there.
Yeah, Morocco. And there was an intriguing transcription of probably a violin solo in
Mm.
in amongst the manuscripts with this title. And we don't know today whether this was an actual prayer or whether this was my guess is that it was something instrumental to accompany, like between the prayers or something like
Understood.
there's
Probably.
no text or anything like that.
Mhm.
And it was just really beautiful and kind of what I like about there's a number of Hasidic tunes on here, nigunim, that are not really what we would call necessarily klezmer music, although once you put it in the instrumental
Sure.
context, it becomes klezmer. I think anything can be klezmerized in that sense.
Yes.
And I like them because they have very free form shapes. They're much less so. Like if you look at the classic sort of whether they're danced to or not, but the ones that have metric structures with
Mhm.
fixed, say 16 bars in a section, and then you repeat it, and then you do the next section and a
Right.
third section, and then you maybe go back to the second section or you go back to the first section and just keep repeating. These kinds of dance structures are tend to be much more symmetrical. And
Mhm.
these are not at all symmetrical. And I think part of it is because they were composed uh, well, first of all, once you take the beat away, right, you have
Mhm.
much more flexibility in terms
Sure.
of form. But also, I think a lot of the nigunim were composed by people who didn't have musical training in that sense. So
Mhm.
they weren't, didn't have that straight jacket
Mhm.
that trained musicians have, where everything has to be regular and repeat and be symmetrical and all of those kinds of things. And that
Mhm.
attracted me. So and this particular tune had that kind of a form.
Right. Well, that reminds me quickly there, in Hebrew, in the Tehillim, in the Book of Psalms,
Mm-hmm.
that is often the case, right? The meter is not regular in a
Mm-hmm.
particular psalm, right? And so 100, 150 years ago, right, German higher critical scholars would tend to say, well, let's take out any of the words we can to make the meter perfect, and then we can say that was the original text.
Right.
But that was just silly. Looking back on that now, we know it was silly, and so some of the verses have bicola, some of them are tricola.
Mhm.
The meters are everywhere,
Mhm.
right? So that is interesting. In any case, the album Midnight Prayer is the first album of yours that I heard,
Oh, uh-huh.
and I have to say the first 60 seconds hooked me for
Mhm.
life. I mean, that was incredible
Mhm.
because what happens in those first
Mhm.
60 seconds, at least the way I experience it in myself,
Mhm.
is it goes from uh, tranquil to
Mhm.
outrageously hilarious to ecstasy.
Mhm.
Right. And of course, that's very typical of Klezmer.
Mhm.
But I think it's also the instrumentation that your ensemble has that hooked me, because most of the Klezmer I'd heard up to that point didn't have like electric piano, for instance, electric keyboards, and there's I wouldn't call it contemplative, but there's a
Mhm.
lot of passages in your work where, yeah, I would call it contemplative.
Mhm.
But in any case, that's not an experience that I think anyone will have in music very often, to be hooked,
Mhm.
right, to a new composer, just because of like this, the first 30 or 60 seconds one hears. You usually got to listen to a bit more, right? Like
Mhm.
a Beethoven symphony, for instance, if you
Oh.
hear it for the first time, other than the fifth, right? But the third or the seventh, you got to listen to it for a while before you really know what's going on, and
Mhm.
really get involved, and you have to listen to it to the
Right.
end. So
Well, one of the things I like about these tunes, a lot of the really great ones
mhm.
they're like haiku. They're so simple and
Yes,
so minimalistic, and it's like if you well, I mean, obviously you can change notes here and there, and we
sure.
do all the time, but they're kind of perfect in and of themselves, often. And this, even just that the beginning of the Midnight Prayer, which was an excerpt from one of these nigunim,
Mhm,
and it's very simple, right?
mhm,
That's the whole thing.
Right.
Um, it's in major. It's nothing exotic. But
Right.
it's static in a way, and and I thought that was a good way um, to start the recording. I guess one thing about the group, of course, is, I mean, we're not traditional instrumentation in the sense. First of all, we have accordion, which
Hmm.
um, accordion. I mean, there were solo accordion recordings made as early as, I think there's even some from 1905 or
Hmm.
1906. So they're
Hmm.
among the very first recordings of klezmer music. But as a solo instrument, as an accompaniment or a band membership instrument,
Hmm.
part of the ensemble, really didn't start so much until the 1930s. And
Hmm.
so, and all of this music predates that. So the idea of having an accordion is a little bit of an anachronism, but I love
Sure.
the sound of it,
Hmm.
and I loved Claudio's playing, and I've worked with a number of great accordionists. Josh is fantastic, Alan Byrne, and so forth. And so, music traditions change, and there's no
Sure.
question in my mind that accordion would not have become central to klezmer in Eastern
Sure.
Europe if it had continued to flourish there. And it did become central in the United States in the 1930s and 40s. So,
Right.
um, and then we have a large concert cymbalum, which there was one historical precedent for that.
Hmm.
Right, it's a large hammer dulcimer with a pedal system, so it's sort of like
Hmm.
almost halfway between a piano and a hammered dulcimer.
Right.
Um, there was this guy Yussel, or Joseph Moskowitz, who was a he owned various so taverns and restaurants on the Lower East Side, but he was a
Hmm.
virtuoso of the Hungarian cymbalum, and he played Jewish and Romanian and Hungarian music and so forth. So there was this precedent, but mostly he also played as a soloist. There were some recordings where he played integrated into a band, but so
Hmm.
it's a little bit, it's not. I've never tried to be. Lenient Troy or whatever we call it.
Sure. Understood.
Uh,
Understood. Fair enough. Yeah.
I always tried to make the best possible music, and with the best musicians that I could work with. So
Sure. Sure.
Alman Balog is one of the great cymbal players of Hungary. So he and I have been collaborating for more than 25 years now.
Hmm. Hmm. I,
Um,
I notice in some of your more recent work, right,
mhm.
that now your ensemble has recorded some Hasidic songs, right, in Yiddish, like the Niggin of Reb Mendel, for instance,
That's
that
right.
album. So
Yeah.
how did you were you always interested in the vocal music, or was that something that developed later?
No, I've always been interested in the singing.
All
I
right.
mean, I love the old Yiddish theater recordings, and also
Mhm.
the old Yiddish folk singing, and of course singing from other cultures
All
very
right.
much. Um, I guess my first couple of groups were strictly instrumental, but Brave Old World, featured largely Michael Alpert as the singer, and who's
Mhm.
a wonderful Yiddish singer, and the material we developed in that group was about 50-50
All right.
instrumental and
Mhm.
vocal. So that's always been there. I hadn't really worked that much with singers in the interim period, but I spent 3 years in Ithaca, New York. I had a postdoc at Cornell, and
Mhm.
um, and the Chabad rabbi there, a guy named Eli Silberstein,
Mhm.
um, is very musical, and he grew up in Antwerp. So he came from a Chabad or Lubavitch family. They had escaped from the Soviet Union with fake passports and this sort of
Mhm.
thing, and
Mhm.
settled in Antwerp. But as a kid, he took an interest in music. He loves klezmer music too. That's how we kind of connected on our mutual love of klezmer and nigunim. And he went around to all the different shtieblach, to all the different little synagogues, not
Mhm.
just of the Chabad, but he learned from all the different communities, their nigunim. And and so when I moved to Ithaca, and I started hanging around with him, and realized he's a wonderful sort of source of he's a source of learning, but also
Mhm.
of music and melody and so forth. And so we
Mhm.
started performing together. He started. I was working with Pete Rushevsky, who's the now the director of the Center for Traditional Music and Dance in New York.
Mm.
We played together for about 10 years, and with Pete and some of the other local Ithaca musicians, we started performing with Ellie Silberstein, and then we developed several programs of nigunim, and then
Mhm.
decided to focus on one that was largely in Yiddish. Um, so some of them are tried and true melodies that are quite well known, and some of them are fairly obscure. And I
Mhm.
really liked that recording, but it went over like a ton of bricks, to be honest.
Mhm.
I thought it would be an inroad into the Orthodox community, but of course the Orthodox community loves those melodies. But as you mentioned, electric keyboard, and if you go to a Hasidic wedding nowadays, the bands, they're much more modern with electric
They are, yes. Mhm.
guitar, synthesizer, all that stuff. And so it was sort of a clash of aesthetics, I think, even though they might have admired the singing.
Yeah. Well, you have to be true to yourself,
Yeah,
right? So,
yeah. Well, I mean,
yeah,
nothing I've ever done was made with the goal of making the big bucks. But I had
right.
thought that it might be an inroad into that community, but it hasn't really
Yeah.
taken up there. I think partly because it was on the label it was on, Traditional Crossroads, which is a fantastic
Mhm.
label run by a guy named Harold Hagopian, who's himself a musician. His father was a well-known Armenian musician, Richard
Mhm.
Hagopian, and he had all kinds of fantastic Armenian, Turkish, Greek, I don't know, Bulgarian, Jewish, etc. music on this label. Unfortunately, he's decided not to continue it. Um,
Mhm.
and I think Niggin of Reb Mendel was one of the last productions that
Well, the last.
he did on that label. That was 13 years. Is it really true? 2010. It could be. Yeah, I think we
Mhm.
recorded it in 2007, maybe.
Mhm.
It was
Mhm.
originally supposed to be on John Zorn's label, Tzaddik.
Mhm.
But John, I didn't know. I mean, we're good friends, but I didn't realize he's not really that fond of singers, I guess, in the main, or of
Mhm.
vocal music. And I think that, in the combination with the fact that it was a bit too much on the traditional side
Mhm.
for him, he decided after he had sort of commissioned it, he then decided to pass on it, and I did a different album for his label and put
Mhm.
this out on the more traditional.
Yeah, just out of curiosity, um, Marty and I
Mm-hmm.
have corresponded, you know, several times about, you know, like some Moroccan
Mm-hmm.
78s and things like this. So,
Mm-hmm.
have you ever researched the Moroccan recordings and traditions?
Only as a fan.
All right,
But there's a wonderful historian now, Chris Silver. You've probably seen his book.
heard of them? Yeah, yeah.
Christopher Silver. He wrote a wonderful book, which I haven't read yet, but I've seen several of his presentations on the material from it, on North African Jewish music,
Mhm.
or the Jewish contribution to North African sort of popular.
Yeah, it's just again, just
It's fantastic stuff.
yeah, taking advantage of the situation here. I mean, I
Yeah.
lived there for 10 years. I married there, right? And then we relocated here to
Hmm.
Italy. But yeah, there's so oh wow. Of course, there are 3,000 Jews still in
Hmm.
Darbet in Casablanca, but you do hear traditional Jewish music, very Sephardic, of course, on the national television there regularly,
Hmm.
and so um, if one is wealthy, which I'm not, right, one could buy right some of these older recordings, right, of
Yeah.
Jewish Moroccan Jewish music, right.
Prices have become exorbitant for old 78s, but the good news is that, first of all, a lot of collectors are making them available to archives, and or they're digitizing them and putting them up on
Mhm.
whatever,
That's right.
archive.com
Yes.
or Bandcamp, or
Yes.
whatever. So that happened in
Mhm.
the Yiddish case. There's a woman named Sherry Mayrunt who's a member of the Klezmer community. I've known her for decades, and
Mhm.
some years ago, I don't know how long ago, maybe 20 years ago or something, she started collecting Yiddish 78s. She amassed what's quite likely the largest collection
Mhm.
anywhere of this music. And At first I thought like, you know, another private collection that nobody has access to. But she really went the 9 yards, and then placed the whole thing at University of Wisconsin-Madison.
Hmm.
So, and they're putting the whole thing up online. A big chunk of it is already up online. Um, so that's a great boon to research. And of course with Greek, there's the Kunadish
Sure.
archive for Greek is
Hmm.
fantastic, and I'm
Hmm.
sure there's probably ones for. In fact, I think Chris Silver is putting up a lot of his digitizations up online. I
Hmm.
forget the name of his website, but it's pretty easy to find, I think. But
Sure.
yeah, I
Sure.
love that music. I first became exposed to it probably around 1990 when I was first living in Berlin. A lot of those
Hmm.
musicians were living in France, the ones who were still alive and some of the ones who were no longer alive at that time. And so they occasionally would perform in Berlin.
Hmm.
When I lived in Berlin, there was still, I guess it still exists, but well, for one thing, there was the International Institute for Traditional Music, which
Hmm. Right.
had been founded by Yehudi Menuhin and some other
Right.
luminaries back in I want to say maybe the 1950s.
Hmm.
And it continued up until the early 90s when it lost its funding.
Hmm.
But they would put on annual festivals, sometimes more than once a year, fantastic festivals of all kinds of world music. And then there's this Haus der Kultur in der Welt, the House of
Hmm.
World Cultures. There's also one in Paris, not affiliated, but the Maison des what is it, Culture du Monde or something like that,
Hmm.
right? Where they're putting on the Haus der Kultur in der Welt. They had something like upwards of 250 concerts a year of the most
Wow.
diverse and
Hmm.
fantastic musicians you can imagine. So that was a really great resource living there. And
Hmm.
so one of the things I did
Sure.
in contact with
Sure.
was North African Jewish music, which I
You
didn't.
know, yeah, there's in Morocco, the Jewish style. A lot of it is predictable, but not in a bad way. And that is right. You start off with this slow, often very ecstatic
Mm-hmm.
solo,
Mm-hmm.
just a few instruments,
Mm-hmm.
and then within 30 seconds or a minute, it it gets heavy dance. Right, so you
Mm-hmm.
get this really heavy dance beat, and
Mm-hmm.
the mood changes. Right. So anyway,
Mm-hmm.
what about current and then future projects and
Oh,
plans?
sure. Well, academically, I'm working on a few things that I don't know. Well, one thing is I guess it's going to lead to some kind, not a publication, but I'm working on one part of what's called the Global Jukebox. This
Hmm.
is the Association for Cultural Equity, I think it's called. It was founded by Alan Lomax when he was still alive,
Hmm.
and his daughter Anna has been running it all these years since his passing. And one of the projects they have is this thing called the Global Jukebox, where they're putting all the Lomax recordings up
Uh-huh.
online
Hmm.
with following his descriptions of the various culture groups
Right.
and the characteristics and so forth. But it's going beyond that. And so now um, the part that I'm working on is there was an NEH funded grant to do what they call journeys, which are kind of guided tours through various parts of the collection. And it's not just limited to that collection. We're bringing in a lot of music from the outside.
Hmm.
And so three teams of scholars are working on, two of us are working on Ashkenazi Jewish music, two on black music, and two on country music in the US. I mean,
In
the
the U.S.
focus is, how these things manifested themselves in the US. But we start in Europe, and the black group starts in Africa and so forth. And I suppose the country group starts in the British Isles or something. And so that we just did the first phase, and now they've applied for funding for the second phase.
Sure.
So hopefully it will ever end up online. So that's
Online.
one thing I'm
Uh-huh.
working on. As far as my own research goes, a lot of it is collaborative at this point. And like I said, I mean, I'm
Hmm.
collaborating with Nico or Dulidis a lot. Maybe we'll do some publishing. I'm not sure yet. I hope so, or maybe at least some presentations or something.
Hmm.
And sometimes it's just going down a rabbit hole with one particular melody and trying to trace the different versions across
Sure.
cultures and how they change, and where it might have originated, and what are the differences, and these kinds of things. So that's sort of that. And as far as music performing goes, I've been working for the last 3 years, no, for the last 10 years approximately, with a group from the Bay Area called Varetsky Pass.
Hmm.
And that's Josh Horowitz, with whom I had this duo back in the 90s, and Stuart Brotman was the original bass player from Brave Old World, and we've been playing music together for 40 years, more
Hmm.
than 40 years. And Cookie Siegelstein is the violinist and the band leader. And the group's been around for, I want to say, 20 years, maybe a little more than 20 years at this point.
Hmm.
And they put out several CDs before we started collaborating, but we've done 2 productions together. The most recent was this, the Magid Chronicle,
Margaret.
and
Mm-hmm.
it's based on Sophia Magid, was a sort of the female Bergovsky, as it were. She was a musicologist,
Interesting.
ethnomusicologist in, I think she was originally from Belarus, was based in St. Petersburg, if I'm not mistaken. And she collected mostly Yiddish song, but also instrumental klezmer music. So we put together
Hmm.
this suite of mostly music that she collected. And it's quite interesting because she collected other things. I mean, some of it overlaps with what we knew from Bergovsky and his and Ansky,
Hmm.
Joel Engel,
Sure.
and Kisselhoff and those guys. But she collected other types of melodies that we weren't familiar with. So that was exciting. And now we're working on, well, I probably shouldn't say too much of it because I don't want to jinx the project. We haven't
Sure.
recorded it yet, but we have another project based on Eastern European instrumental music that I think we're going to record in the spring.
I see. I see. Well, let's end on a theoretical note, or at least with a theoretical question. We started off that way, right, with comparing music and language. Now that you mentioned, right, that studying
Hmm.
all available versions of a
Hmm.
particular melody, this brings to my mind the diachronic synchronic methodology of Claude Levi-Strauss. All right.
Right.
So, have you thought of that comparison?
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
All
I
right.
think most of what I've done. I mean, well, of course, what I did in my dissertation and what my book is based on is synchronic, right? I
Sure.
took basically a sample of recordings that were all made between 1922 and 29, I think, by 2 particular musicians. So it's a fairly closed group, and compared across that, rather than trying to look at how were they playing in 1890, which of course we don't know
Right.
because we
Right.
don't have any recordings. Um, it's harder, I think, to do diachronic studies based on recorded music or based on live music because it's too sparsely documented.
Exactly.
But I think it's probably possible to do with certain melodies if you found enough versions of
Hmm.
something across a long enough of several things across a long enough
Right.
time period, you could probably start to see the patterns of how that there were things that were changing
Right.
in
Right.
line with
Right.
each other. But my feeling about like the klezmer music, I think it was always, and it still is today, it was something that incorporated various historical layers at the same time.
Sure.
So when we're listening to those recordings, say that were made in the 1910s and 1920s, they're obviously playing music that was probably very up to date, and maybe they just wrote it for the
Sure.
studio or something like
Of
that.
course. Yeah. Yeah.
But they were also playing melodies that might have been at that time 100 or even 150 years old.
Hmm.
And I think these layers always existed side by side. I don't think it's not like the music as a whole
Hmm.
evolved. It's like there were always these older layers and these newer layers, and then yet a newer layer was added to
Right.
those
Right.
already existing layers. So you get kind of like sedimentation,
Right. Right.
um,
Right.
which adds to, I think, the feeling that this music is highly
Hmm.
eclectic, even though it's very predictable, as you say. I mean, the
Right.
forms are very it's infinite variation within a very narrow framework.
Right,
That's what
right.
interested me.
Yeah, the core idea that Levi Strauss had,
Yeah.
right, about this, right, was that mythology, particular myths, you can't understand a particular myth until you have exposed yourself to all available versions, and then
Right.
you might be able to, you start to make sense of what it
Hmm.
is really about, right?
Hmm.
Which is, not everyone can wrap their heads around an approach like that. I can. It comes to me naturally. It makes sense,
Hmm.
right? And so, very good. I really appreciate the donation of your time, the donation of your wisdom, Joel. This has been fascinating.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, I mean,
yes.
speaking of versions, that was one of the things that attracted me to learning lots of versions of things, was
Mhm,
that I found, as somebody who didn't grow up in this tradition, I
mhm.
mean, I did it on a sort of a weird note. It turns out there were probably klezmer musicians in my family, but I didn't know any of them.
Right.
It was the generation of my great grandfather.
Awesome.
I felt, by steeping myself into it, one way to really learn the sort of the meta style, as it were, would be
Mhm.
to learn as many versions of something. And then, you know, by the time you've learned the 10th or 20th version of something, you have no idea. You can't remember what the first one
Right.
sounded like. And it all
Right.
gets jumbled up in your head. And then what comes out is almost inevitably going to be different than any of that.
Yes. Mhm.
So that was kind of a technique that I used. But it's
Right.
also it's very useful for comparing across cultures and across time and all of those kinds of things. Yeah.
Yes.
Anyway, so yeah, it was great talking, and
Yes. Well, let's stay in touch.
yeah,
And I wish you all the best in your life and in your work.
thank you.
If you enjoyed the program, please consider supporting this channel with a donation through Patreon or PayPal. And don't forget to subscribe. Thank you.